You are watching the video version of the Marketing Should Be Fun podcast. We are so glad that you are here. If you prefer to listen to podcasts, you can find the Marketing Should Be Fun show on any of your favorite podcast platforms, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere else. But most of all, we're so glad you're here, and I hope that you enjoy today's conversation. Welcome back to Marketing Should Be Fun. We have a great episode for you today. Wanted to give you a quick heads up that there is some language in today's episode. So if you have little ones or anything like that, or just want to have the heads up, wanted to give that to you. Also, there is some really interesting stuff in this conversation. It's a little bit longer than our typical episodes, but all throughout the conversation are some really interesting insights on storytelling and how to bring in mystery and curiosity to the stories that you are telling as a brand. We talk about how to make video content engaging, how to utilize hooks and not tell the full story to bring people in and kind of engage people with that full content. And we talk about the community that Jesse is building as a paid game master, something that they explain at the start of our conversation as well. So I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening. Well, welcome back to another episode of Marketing Should Be Fun. My name is Austin Savage, and Kelsey is not with me today, but I have an exciting interview for all of you, and I'm really excited for it. This is kind of a fun way to combine my interest that Kelsey and I joke about all the time about how I really like to play D&D with my full-time job and what I do for a living. And there are not very many ways that you can connect Dungeons and Dragons to marketing, but today we are going to do it. So I get to introduce all of you to Jesse William, and Jesse is someone that I play D&D with often. And more interesting than that, Jesse is someone that I pay to play D&D with often, because they are a what's called a paid game master, which I'll let Jesse explain in just a second. But I'm excited for this interview because Jesse is a great storyteller. And I think that there's a lot we can learn. Jesse is also someone that I discovered on TikTok, which I think is really, really fun, who I have taken a step, a next step with that has lasted for almost 2 years now, but I could be wrong. Maybe it's just like a year or something like that. But then also, Jesse is someone who is pursuing a dream that's really close to their heart. And you guys know that I am all about that. So Jesse, welcome to Marketing Should Be Fun. I'm excited to hang out with you in a different way today.
Hell yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we always like to start off with a this or that little segment here. We always say that we're going to battle it out, but this is the most docile section of the whole episode. But I figured, we're going to talk a little bit about this world that you've built. And I know that you're into fantasy and storytelling and all of those things. So the this or that for today is Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. Two classics. If you had to take one, which one?
So there is a slightly long answer to this.
I can't wait.
That I will try to explore in my sleep deprived brain. In the past couple of weeks, upon reflecting on how I run my games and how I include fantasy, or what fantasy does in the games, specifically in regards to Saga and a kind of experiment I'm doing with it, with a one-on-one campaign that I'm recording. I wrote the first session of this campaign, and I felt like it was lacking. It was missing something. It didn't make sense. I was like, well, this is set in a fantasy world. What is fantasy about this story? And so I did some reflection. I wrote an essay just to myself in my notebook.
This is commitment right here.
I was reflecting on three kinds of fantasy. The fantasy of Game of Thrones, the fantasy of Lord of the Rings, and the fantasy of Ghibli films. And what I found about Lord of the Rings is that It's very complicated. The read I'm going to give on it is not a like set in stone. This is the way it is. But the main element of Lord of the Rings is presented as this, which is it is a power fantasy in some regard.
Yeah.
In which it centers the heroes who are the stand-ins for the audience as the like observers of moral truth and agency, and they get to inflict their moral agency upon the world by characterizing all of the like different races as like kind of morally succinct caricatures. It's this
like they fit in a box kind of thing.
Yeah. It's this like problem with that is in the foundations of fantasy. That being said, what it does super well is it is very reverent towards the fantasy. And I think a piece of media that does this very well in like Lord of the Rings is the Rings of Power. I know people have mixed feelings about it, but the way that show loves the idea of it's telling a fantasy story, and it will like the dialogue and everything about it, the way it films like fantasy locations, it's like, this is fantasy.
Yeah.
And that reverence is super important to storytelling. But also I like politics. I like a complicated thought process.
Yeah.
I like having these like things going on. You're not in the Giving and Greed campaign, but like the Giving and Greed campaign, which is just an 8-session campaign, but it's 7 parties, so 7 sessions a week, 8 weeks.
Oh, okay. Wow.
That all center around this like complicated political thing with like 4 different factions and everyone competing interests.
Yeah.
So I like elements from both, and I both take like heavy inspiration from like the reverence and the politics and examining how those work as functions in the story. But definitely Lord of the Rings. I think
all that
it's just more interesting fantasy. I think there's a lot of I think because Game of Thrones also, at least the show, failed.
Yeah.
And George R. R. Martin is a slow ass writer. Like he like does not sit down and do the work. Like I in the time that he has been writing his next book, I've created an entire massive fantasy world.
Right.
So like, you know, there's some like biases from that, but I Lord of the Rings as a piece of fantasy and the way it engages with fantasy and how it means is I think immediately more interesting to me and more appealing to me than what Game of Thrones is.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you kind of like put the differences up against that, because I would pick Lord of the Rings too, and I enjoy both for different reasons. I think they're both great stories, but it's almost hard to, because when I like wrote down that I was like, this should be the this or that for today, I was like thinking about it. I was like, I wonder, you know, if it would have been different if Lord of the Rings had been released like later and would have been released in the same way, like that original story would have been released in the same way that Game of Thrones was as a television show. You know, I just wonder if it would have like still carried that same, you know, beauty in the story, and the same kind of like, there's such an element of what is the word? Like I look at it fondly because I watched it when I was a kid. What word am I thinking of? Yeah, there's a nostalgia to it that I think just sets it apart almost unfairly against Game of Thrones.
Perhaps, but I also think it is the Peter Jackson films, the Lord of the Rings films are just a strong story that very effectively communicate like what Tolkien was trying to go for. Because when you understand that this was Tolkien's reflection on World War I and industrialism and all these elements, you see it very clearly in the way everything's characterized. I don't know how much of that is Peter Jackson's intention, how much of that is just being true to the material and that staying strong. I think it's just a very well told story, but if it was told in the way of Game of Thrones, I don't know if it, would that even mean? Would that completely, like, does it mean it was written in a different time? So does it have different themes that are central to the story, or different reflections upon like industrialism and maybe a different take on race?
On what that means? Yeah, totally. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, well, that was a fun little this or that. We could talk about that forever. That was good. Okay, so let's like back up a little bit. So, a lot of people listening probably like don't even know what Dungeons and Dragons is as a whole, and so we don't have to dive deep into like defining what these kind of like tabletop role playing games are. But I'm curious, like for you, where did the passion for storytelling in the form of D&D generally, and I know you're creating your own system as well, where did that come from, and what does it mean to be a paid game master? Like, what does that look like?
I think there is a moment where, if not the storytelling, the aspect of character became very compelling for me. And it was very early on. I was always very excited about like the prospect of doing D&D just generally.
Yeah.
As soon as I started doing it, like I got into it with a friend, and I would go to a different town to play every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
For however long that lasted. And then I was thinking of all these characters, and then characters became a world, and then a world became me running campaigns in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to run this story, or this campaign at the time. I wouldn't have reflected upon it as a story, but I tried to run this game with just one friend that I wanted to record and put out there, that never got super far. Like my current games are, all of the games back then were set in the same setting, in the same world that all the other current games are set in. The first character who entered my world was my best friend, kind of doing a little test thing before I started a proper campaign.
Okay.
And his character was like your classic like orphan rogue. Don't know where his parents are.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't even know his name, is too young to kind of remember his name. When he made the character and said, "Oh, I don't know where my parents are," I go, "Oh, okay, I do. Of course you do. You that's the first thing you do."
Right.
And I had another friend who was like, "Oh yeah, like my mom was taken or something when I was a kid, don't have a dad, whatever." And so I was like, "Oh, okay, like those two people are in the same place." And then that same player with like the missing mom was the person who I was going to like do the story with, and she wanted to play the mom. And it's like, cool, so here's what's happening. So it starts, and she is with this NPC dad who's been basically captured for 25 years and doesn't know where his son is, doesn't know where his wife is, doesn't know where his sister is. And the first or second session, they're going through this like abandoned city up to this tower, because there's supposed to be like a little scrying thing, a little magic thing, like a magic ball that you look into and can see to some degree whatever you want. So by the time they do that, his son, my friend's character, is already dead. And so I had this moment where he goes first and he looks at his wife, and I'm describing, he's like, he's confused. He's not sure what he's seeing. There's like the evil people who are like around the wife, but the wife is like chilling. That's weird. The sister's like way off in like an isolated place. It's unclear what she's doing. She seems kind of like, I don't know, like adventure hardened in some way. And gets to the sun, and he can't see. It's like dark. It's dark where the sun is. And he's frustrated. He doesn't know what he's looking at. And then someone's walking by with a torch, and so the torch light illuminates the grave, and he reads the name. And I didn't describe any of this. I just went, "That's not his name." And I got myself. I teared up a bit. I was like, huh!
Yeah.
And that was the moment where I was like, oh, that can happen. So
Yeah.
that's when I like, it was very early on that I fell in love with the idea of like characters and emotions, which like doesn't always get to happen in a paid game.
Right.
Because you're dealing with like very different play styles.
Totally.
But for what it means to be a paid game master, so what it means for me, the first thought is just like, I'm super fucking chilling in this job. It's just a very like gratifying job to have. I love being able to tell stories and being able to make up things and have a cool fantasy world for people to like interact with. I love to have people leave their mark. So in the TTRPG space, again, for those who don't know, the company that publishes D&D and many other companies will publish pre-written adventures.
Yeah.
And most people go through those or go through pre-written settings. So if you would imagine like a pre-written adventure is like Lord of the Rings. It's like, here are the things that you go through. You know, you start and Gandalf shows up and he goes, there's a ring that's evil. And you go, oh no, what do I do about this ring? And the story follows.
Yeah.
And then a setting is just, Middle Earth, right? It's like you're given Middle Earth, you're not given direction. The DM, the person who's like in charge of the story or the referee to the story and the players, decides what to do within that space. And so what I do is what people refer to as homebrew, which is I've made up my own world, which you can see a bit somewhat framed behind me. This is a very small, this big map, which if I were to connect all of the consecutive pieces would be like probably 8 to 10 feet wide and 13 feet tall. Crazy. Is a small part of my world.
Right. It's huge.
But so that is called homebrew, in which a person just makes up their own shit. And what I do is I have like a structure for the story or the plot in a very general sense. I know what the biggest, most evil thing is in the world, and then how that trickles down into like the base of the story. But then everything that happens is up to the player's decision.
Yeah.
And I, in every game or every story that I run, all of the players have at least 2 other parties within that setting who are also influencing the story. So, for example, as what Austin has experienced, sometimes that means certain players make very big mistakes and run away from their mistakes into a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And get stranded in the Beast Wilds with another party.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
And sometimes that means that there's only one party who's a group of players who is known to be alive and well within the setting, and they hear about these other missing people and they go, whoop, well, what are we gonna do? And other times, in the case of Giving and Greed, that means the most convoluted, complicated series of events, because you have a set number of things to interact with. Just imagine, I'm not, without any specific detail, a train going this way and then suddenly just taking a 90-degree turn and then taking a 45-degree turn and then turning around and then looping back around. That's been the experience of that story.
Yeah.
Which I know at this point is getting confusing as to what I mean. But this is also helping me illustrate my point of like, I can't explain what I do.
Totally. I love the way that you described that the scene kind of with that gravestone, because it is like, I think that's the most unique thing about storytelling in the way that D&D can, or similar systems. It's just like you have those moments, and I think like that's the same thing for me of like why I come back to it is like there's just these beautiful moments of story as you start to kind of internalize, who your character is or the other characters around you. And these moments that just become possible, they are so just the only word that comes to mind, like they are so beautiful. They really are meaningful from a story perspective. And it's hard to explain. Like, it's like you kind of have to experience it to fully understand, like, oh, like that's what makes this interesting. Like that is the cool, the beauty of that.
It's also is an extension of that. One of the reasons it's like so beautiful and profound is because these are things that like organically happen.
Yeah.
They're not, although as a game master or dungeon master, you might pre-write a scene where an NPC who like game masters play all the NPCs, might have something to say. But most of this stuff is improvised, and especially from the characters. So when you're talking to another character and having an emotional conversation or a charge or whatever it is, and coming to a moment of like emotion or just like some kind of profound revelation, it happens organically, and it happens as an extension of the self. Right. Like when people get into character, it doesn't happen for everyone. There's many different levels at which people play the game.
Yeah.
Some people do play it like a video game, but that's not what I go for. And when a character moment happens as an extension of the self, it's like you feel the things like people. I'm sure you can attest to, your experience in the Third House of Cavilia game, where it's like, the party is getting actually stressed,
right?
And the party's actually feeling worries of the characters, and that's very compelling.
Yeah, it is. So I want to shift from this into just talking a little bit about the kind of like back end of what you're doing, because one of the most interesting things I think is that, and I think this is probably what has helped you be, successful in kind of laying the foundation as a paid game master, is that you've built like a very engaged community. You mentioned that you have, you run like 18 games a week or something. Is that how many it currently is?
Right now, I think I'm at 10 or 11 per week. I at one point I was running like 14 or 15, and I'm going to go back to about that number. I have 4 or so empty games on my schedule that I would like to fill.
So you have these like 14, or currently 11, 12 groups of people who kind of on using Discord. We all just hang out and talk to each other, and there's just these channels where people just like share funny memes or interact with one another, update people on the stories that they're telling, and all of these different things, and it's really interesting to see, because what you have done, and like we often work with our clients about like building a community, right? Like no matter what kind of industry people are in, they want to, be able to say like, hey, we're doing this new thing at our company or our organization, and they want people to care about it and, follow along. And what's been really cool to see is with your stuff is like, you really have built this community where if you say like, hey, I'm offering this new game, or, hey, I want to shift and try something different with, some of the stories that we're telling, for the most part, people are very like excited to be the ones who kind of support you and follow you kind of through that. So I would love to hear, like, from your perspective, how did you, build a community? Like, was it natural? Was it something that you felt like you've really had to cultivate? What does that look like?
It was very natural.
Okay.
Because early on when I first started being a paid GM, I listed 14 different stories on my schedule. And it took a long time to fill anything up.
Yeah.
And so over time, I was like, it's going to be a lot easier. It's also going to be a bit more appealing if instead of having 14 different settings, if I had 3 and just told 3 stories, but then players could help tell a larger story.
Right.
And I had one setting in particular that was really suited to that. in a place called Folia, which is where like the bulk of the players first played in. So as an extension of that, Folia had to have a Discord for all of the just all 8 groups of players, all 40 some people. And then eventually it made sense for the other stories to include them. And at some point I was like, the people would like to be together, I'm sure. Yeah. So I made the Misthian collection box for all the players. And it was just about organizing all these people I had who liked the game. And never, at no point, really, not until you've mentioned like me having a community of players have I really thought about it like that.
Yeah.
Because it's more of like a necessity. Like even like the memes and like all this stuff was just like, this is what people want.
Right.
People want ways to like express themselves and engage. Where I would, mentioning that like every business wants, people to be able to engage with it. I think the trouble with that, for example, on TikTok. So most of my players do come from TikTok.
Okay.
But it is hard to get people to care enough about you to join up in one of your games. You have to get really lucky. Like I on TikTok was making like 3 videos a day from like March or April until June last year to get the players that I did. And I had 3 videos get like 60 to 90,000 views.
Yeah.
And that's how I did it. Because I think what's more applicable here is when talking about community around your business or your product, getting that interest to begin with. Because once someone's bought in, right, and there's going to be like different levels of buy-in. Like my thing is very, it's media, right? It's media. So if I were to expand this, because I'm doing that story with a friend that I'm going to be posting. Yeah. Or I've already posted an episode of it. If a community of people surround that outside from the games, people want to talk about it, people want to engage with it, people want to tell their theories. And so then there's an opportunity to like bring a separate audience in. But for the Discord that I have, it's a group of people who are already deeply bought in, who are spending $80 American a month or more, depending on the games that they're in, to invest in a very cool and niche thing, and people fucking love to talk about their Dungeons and Dragons. People love that shit. It would be hard to keep these people apart. Yeah. But on the TikTok side of things, like it's difficult to get people to care, because the reason you want to get people to care is to make money, right? Like that's what you want. And at least for me, I have a very hard time being disingenuous. Not to say I'm like, oh, I'm so perfect and honest, but I just am probably a little autistic in that sense of like, I can't like do the fake thing. Like you can have really dumbed down content, but it's like, that's not effective for what I want. Yeah. I've even realized recently that I had someone join one of my games. I've had a couple of people reach out in the past week. It's been a decent week for that. Good. But I've not taken any of these players because it's so clear the way they approach the conversation to begin with that they're not going to be a good fit for me as a DM. Yeah. If I'm trying to tell a story, if I'm going for every game being like Third House of Cavilia, I can't keep taking in kind of like average players. I really need people who are like super interested in storytelling. Yeah. And so that's a niche audience and making content for that. Basically what you're doing, there's 2 things. One of them I did last night after the game, and it's working out well, which is genuine content. When you're just excited about a thing, when you just have energy in you and you want to get it off your chest, and you open up a video and say, hey, I'm doing this thing. Because otherwise it's like a staged prompt, right? It's like it's a construct through which you try to weave in the product, which is my games. And it's people can tell always. Yeah. You begin a video and you try to say something mysterious or interesting or exciting to get people's attention. You do all the things.
Yeah.
But it's so obvious a setup. It's obviously a setup, and people can tell. And so I think that's the difficulty when it comes to like other kinds of products. Like say you sell, I don't know, like handles.
Yeah.
Say you're a handle salesman. And you're really good. You have a really wonderful insight about handles. How do you sell that product to people? If in the IKEA sense of like people like go to IKEA and they buy their handles for the drawer and they mix and match or whatever. How do you sell that genuinely?
Yeah.
How do you get people excited about handles? The only thing you can do is either have a really well thought out construct, or you can just get excited yourself. But when you're doing a job 7 days a week, in my case, it's hard to like always be excited.
Right.
It's hard to like rise that energy up in yourself. So that's really like my observations about
That's interesting. I think there's a tension that a lot of people feel when it comes to like creating content in that sense, because and this is something we talk about here on the podcast a lot too, is when we're talking about content marketing, that's the type of marketing we do as an agency. And the big thing there is like building trust. And in order to build trust, you have to give value, and you have to, continue giving value so that as, the audience builds trust in you, they're more likely to, take a next step when you present it. But there is always this tension for people of like, it's really hard to create content and not talk about your product and like what you're wanting people to go towards, because that's like at the end of the day what you need from them in return. But there's like an extension of trust that has to go back and forth of like, hey, I am you're trusting me to give you value, and I am also trusting you to, take action on that value whenever you're ready to. And so that's interesting that you kind of talk about how it's your audience can very easily see through, if there's a bait and switch kind of coming of like, hey, I'm going to pretend to be giving you value, but then I'm really just going to ask you for something. Have you found it helpful to just do one or the other? Just create something of like, hey, this is something I'm excited about and want to update you on, or hey, I just want to invite you to join my game or do this thing?
The former works much better.
Yeah.
Every once in a while I'll put out a video that's like, hey, applications are up, here's the thing.
Yeah.
And to be fair at this point, so the first time I did this, I got like 4 or 5 applications. I don't think any of them were really I took in as players.
Yeah.
But I got a number of applications, and it was like 200 views, and it was like a couple of applications. And so it's like extremely effective, like transfer rate or like ratio of like people viewing, people clicking on your little link to the audience, the application. But I think also there might have been some momentum of like me doing TikTok before, because that was maybe in, let's say, January to March of this year.
Okay.
And at that point, I had definitely stopped making TikToks consistently, but it was only a couple of months away from a couple of like big videos. Whereas like when I started doing that in June and July, when I was like, I need players, but a video of like, hey, applications are up, here's the vibe, and very little response. So just getting excited, finding ways to get excited is one thing. And then also I think consistency. I'm trying very hard to maintain a presence on TikTok.
Yeah.
I have a couple of things that are working now as far as like concepts to execute on. That being said, do I have the like internal power to output when I am already doing all this stuff?
Yeah, it's hard.
It's very hard. I realized I've had 2 videos do very, very well recently in the past month and a half or so that are both sketches. And what I think about most when it comes to my audience on TikTok and how it transfers into players is I want to focus on my niche so that the ratio of followers to players is like pretty high in a relative sense. Still like, in ratio sense, like very low. But I don't want 100,000 followers and none of them be players, right?
Yeah.
but also you do need the attention.
Mm-hmm.
You do need the attention, because if I make a great video, if I make a phenomenal video and I get lucky on a concept that's like, here's an idea about storytelling, 10,000 views in the upper limit.
Mm-hmm.
If I made 2 funny little ditty sketches and I got 80,000 and around 50,000 views that the 2 are sitting at, and a bunch of followers.
Yeah.
I'm experimenting and diving into that realm.
Yeah.
Just to get attention, just to be a presence.
Mm-hmm.
Because another thing I think that's a part of this job is personality.
Yeah.
People attach themselves to personality.
I love the takeaway, you mentioned this a few minutes ago, but of you found the most success in creating content when you're excited about something. Like, I think that is just a really interesting kind of takeaway, is like, you were talking about how your community should be genuine, right? Like you're wanting to build community around a genuine concept and create content that people connect with that is from a genuine place. And I think it is true. Like, you should be creating that content that is exciting to you. I mean, that's why the show's called Marketing Should Be Fun. Cause like when you're doing that, then it feels more fun, because you know that like the people that are connecting with your content, like they are connecting it with something that you are excited for them to connect with. It doesn't feel as forced, which can be a challenge sometimes, but I think that that's a good lens to look at it through, of like, do I feel excited about this angle of what I'm doing?
Yeah. And it also comes down to, again, like having an effective audience.
Yeah.
Because there are people on TikTok who I follow or see their videos who have upwards of like 20,000 more followers.
Yeah.
Who've also tried the paid DMing thing and have not gotten to where I get, because they do comedy stuff. They do silly little videos, which is nothing wrong with silly little videos. Yeah. I love a silly little video on TikTok.
Right.
I follow these people. You ask when you're coming to a product, why do people care?
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, again, this centers around personality and value. I'm sure it's very different depending on the product. Mm-hmm. Again, if you're selling carrots, I'm sure it's like really hard to sell carrots.
To be excited all the time. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Making consistent content around your topic.
Yeah.
And showing that you have insights about this. Again, I think I only have 3,700 followers, but that most of my players now are from TikTok,
right? And
that sustains me as a living. Where there are people who are out here who have larger followers, or for example, there's even someone who's like not in the D&D space. Yeah. There's one creator on TikTok who does like media stuff, talks about movies or whatever, and rants. And I saw them like a year ago. They have like 100,000 followers at least 100,000 followers, probably more, probably triple that. And I saw them asking for help with money.
Interesting.
And I was like, I have fractions of what you have in terms of following, but that sustains me.
Right.
And that's also, to be fair, because the product I'm selling is also, to relative to other things, is expensive.
Yeah.
Right. Because if your product is $2 a month, you need a ton of people,
right,
to buy into that to make rent.
Yeah.
But if your product is $20 per person a week, it's
easier. Yeah.
Much easier,
for sure. You're an entrepreneur in many ways. You're providing kind of a living for yourself as you are, creating this brand around like the style of games that you run. What have you found to be the hardest part of creating, of building this brand, of being a quote unquote entrepreneur? And how have you accommodated as a result of that? There
are two things. One is just the marketing. One is just the TikTok side of things and doing social media.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't like TikTok as a platform.
Yeah.
If I could be off it, if I could not use it, I would. But it's part of my job.
Right.
And after gaining my player base back in like October, November of last year, once I hit kind of capacity, I was like, I'm I don't need to do this. I don't want to do this. I'm not going to do this.
Yeah.
But I also understood that I do need to maintain an audience.
Right.
And I didn't do that. And now I'm in a position where, as I'm running games, which I would have been running games and making content anyway, but as I'm running games, I'm now like scrambling to try to make content to get people interested and excited about them. The other thing is with this job, it's an intensely social job. D&D is a social thing, and people do it on their free time.
Right.
When is everyone's free time? After they work.
Yeah.
So all of my work time is everyone else's free time, and that's
hard.
socially difficult. And so I circle burnout a lot. And I burnt out a bunch of times this year.
Yeah.
And so it's just scheduling. It's just I'm on a thing of like 8 weeks on, 1 or 2 weeks off.
Yeah.
When money permits. Right now is a bit of a weird situation, which is why I'm desperately trying to get more players and do more TikTok stuff. But it's just scheduling is how I accommodate, and making sure that when I have time off, I'm embracing that time off. And when I'm getting overwhelmed as well, which I have been in the last like week or two, the prospect of when you run a game, you're a captain fun and you're leading these people through these things. And that can just kind of sit with you, and taking a moment to like relax and bring down the tension and get the mind a bit more focused and running a bit slower. Because I do a thing. Sometimes I get talking really fast and I say things and I stop and I go, And when you're trying to tell a story, there are people who do this very professionally, who have a lot of uhs, but something I'm mindful of like, if I can slow things down and if I can be more interesting, like I feel like I've been a little bit for this podcast.
You've done great.
I should try to reach out to that. So those are the elements that I'm like having to deal with and cope with, I suppose.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about all sorts of different things. So, we talked about TikTok, we talked about this community that we're building, and in some ways, I think that we got a lot of storytelling principles just in your rant about Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones at the beginning. The question I'm going to ask, feel free to answer it as it is or in a way that's more interesting to you. But, a lot of our audience think of the content that they're creating as storytelling, right? Like they want to draw people in to the story that they are telling as a brand, the story of what they're trying to accomplish in the world, or the story of, the journey that they are taking in life, and, wanting to kind of bring people into that. I would be curious how you kind of look at the idea of telling a good story, and what some, potential kind of bridges might be between the storytelling that you're doing and some of the storytelling that brands as a whole are trying to accomplish as well.
Central to every good story is two things: tension and mystery. Now, what are you thinking about right now?
Well, I'm thinking about like books, I'm thinking about like Harry Potter, and I'm thinking about like, I'm also thinking about the way that you do that in the campaigns that we run. But
if anyone's found me interesting to listen to in this podcast, because something I kind of do naturally to some extent when I'm like active and aware, or like in the zone to some extent, is you say things that build tension and mystery, because that's how you get interest.
Yeah.
In fact, to such a degree that like mystery is so important to me. It is foundational to my entire fantasy world. And in regards to, for example, if we're looking at movies and media as baselines for storytelling, I think what a lot of people have, everybody has some degree of novelty, right? Yeah. Which doesn't go very far, because the problem with novelty. So let's frame this as, someone wants to do content where they're talking about their journey. their journey is novel. Their journey is unique to them. But novelty needs to increase. You need to raise the stakes in novelty consistently. Otherwise, people are going to lose interest. They're going to find another novel thing. But if you get attention with a mystery, a question, something that makes people go, hey, whoa, wait a minute. What do you mean by that? What do you mean?
Yeah.
That is going to keep people interested in the story.
Well, how do you do that in your content?
You start with a vague statement that is claiming something unclear. It's clear and unclear what it's claiming. So it's like it's typically comes out with like a strong take. You kind of start in the middle by saying this thing is broken and it sucks. I don't know, something like that. But every time I make a video, you try to, the first line that you say is something that gets attention in that way. It's something that's central to the message of the video that needs the video or the rest of the content to explain it. That's why, if you notice in a lot of videos on TikTok or YouTube, where the first couple of seconds of the video are something from the middle of the video and like the height of the action. Which a lot of people try to fabricate the action. What you should do is find the core of the story that is your content or your life or whatever. Figure out what's interesting about it and tell people half. Right? Because the problem is you want to tell everyone everything. You want to give them all the information. But if you're being, it's that like kind of FOMO thing of, if you're being too upfront, people are like, well, this person's giving me everything. I don't care. But if you're like, I have this thing. It's pretty cool. People are like, well, tell me about the thing. Don't, right? And so like, as just one example of like in story, in the first game that you played in, in the very first session in that campaign, not your campaign, but the first session in all 4 campaigns,
like groups.
I had a town that was just kind of like put to the sword, and a group of warriors, the Aeginian knights, who weren't doing anything about it. And it's like, what's up with that? You're knights. Shouldn't you do something about that? Why didn't you do something about that? And that raises a bunch of questions that then motivated the players through 26 or 28, 30 sessions of the campaign. Until just life happened and those players eventually dispersed. So present it in a way that makes people go, huh? What does that mean? Be intentionally vague. You have to, and that's also where tension comes in, right? You have to be able to hold the tension of keeping things inside and drip feeding them to people, whether it be in a single video or if you're telling a longer form narrative. Have some kind of piece of information that you are heading towards, but you're holding tension and mystery around. That's my like big insight about storytelling, and what keeps people engaged is mystery and tension.
That's really interesting, because so your connection to, like creating videos of like I love the phrase, tell people half. I think that's like a really interesting phrase. So we always call that like our hook. Like you need a hook at the beginning of a video. But I've never thought of that as like mystery. I've never thought of that as like, it's really like, it's triggering that curiosity of, when people see a podcast clip where somebody says something absolutely crazy, then it's like the curiosity of like, how did we get there? Like what is the circumstance that led to that? And then I love the takeaway too of, you mentioned that this question for some of your players, like that it influenced their motivation and curiosity to stick with you for, almost 30 sessions, which, is a lot of time committed. I think that there is an element of that there is a level of mystery that I think that brands can employ to keep people involved for just a long time, to keep asking the same questions and to keep, presenting problems in a way that engages the curiosity of their audience instead of just telling them everything that they need to know.
I think with brands and like products as well, outside of what I do,
Yeah.
I think, and this is just like an opinion that I've come to. I'm not an expert in any sense, but as someone who's interested in storytelling, because there's two ways that can go wrong as trying or like a brand can go wrong. One is that you become a grift, where it's like you've mastered the mystery, right? You're saying, I have this thing that you can attain that I will constantly hold over you, or you can be too upfront and people lose interest. You give away the cat or not the cat. You give away the whatever.
Yeah.
Do you know the phrase I'm going
Whatever
for?
the phrase. I can't think of what the word is, but yeah.
Give away the house. I don't know. You give away all the information and people go, well, why do I need you?
Right.
And I think if there's an angle or a balance to that, I think it is inviting people along a journey of exploration, because the general truth about the world that I believe about the world is also, and the reason it's a foundation of storytelling, is because we don't know so much,
right?
And truth is not absolute all the time, and so if you as a brand are not selling the perfect solution, but the best one that you can figure out right now, and you're going for better. And that's the story of your companies, is the exploration of this small niche of truth and the discovery. Because don't even get me started on discovery and what that means emotionally and all these things, how it comes into gameplay. I think that is compelling to me. Is not putting yourself above the audience and saying, "Let me give this to you." Because that also putting yourself with the audience and saying, I'm leading you towards this exploration is also more genuine.
Yeah.
It's also more genuine. And that's, again, a thing that I really struggle with is being disingenuous. Like I said earlier, I hate being disingenuous, but sometimes you kind of feel like you have to be just to put something out.
This is a super random, but the other day during one of our sessions, you went on a little rant, but we were talking about like, we were talking about video games and how they start. And there was a recent video game that was released, and you were talking about like how it's a video game called Starfield, and I haven't played it yet. But you were talking about how you hated the beginning, and the takeaway that you were saying is like, when you start telling a story, you have to drop people into the middle of a situation, a circumstance that's interesting but also confusing, so that people feel like they're seeing the problem, they're seeing, what kind of situation that they're in. And that's like the start of like, how are we going to get out of this? Like, what is the journey from here? And just that like little conversation we had was really interesting, because not only in, the stories I'm telling and, stuff like that, like even just from a work perspective, I've been thinking about that recently, because I'm like, how just even for, when we're writing blog posts and putting together podcast episodes, just doing like regular content things that we're doing, I'm like, how can we really push to tell stories with this stuff of like, with that same principle of like helping people feel like they are kind of in that, like seeing the problem that's trying to be solved, or kind of feeling the tension of that moment. I just think that that's really interesting.
Man, when you mentioned that, it raised a fire in me, because it's so I think this explaining the prompt here might be helpful in understanding like what this means when we're talking about like a bad setup to a story. To give Starfield some credit, which I've not personally experienced, but I've heard. Central to Starfield is this like cosmic mystery that your character explores. Where there's this like maybe ancient kind of technology or something that is I don't know, special. I don't know that much about it, but even then, like,
because you stopped playing.
Because I stopped playing an hour into playing. So two examples of a good story. So Starfield is published by a game studio called Bethesda Game Studios, who made Skyrim, which I mentioned earlier in the episode, which has a phenomenal start to the game. Another comparison we were talking about before the podcast, Baldur's Gate 3. So how do those two things set up your story? And I'm going to, after this, I'm going to give a third story, or I'm going to give an excerpt of a story from my own life at a point that is interesting. Now, also notice what I'm doing here. I'm telegraphing what I'm going to say in the future. I'm creating a little seed of interest there. Like, well, what's your comparison? So start with Skyrim. The story starts, and you are on a cart with a bunch of prisoners. You're being taken to being executed.
Yeah.
Already, you're like, how did I get in this situation? What's going on? Yada, yada, yada. I don't think I need to explain anything more about that to get you interested. That's, you're being executed. And then some other stuff happens that's more confusing. A dragon shows up and you escape. But it establishes this conflict, this political conflict within the game of these two factions. It establishes the dragon shit that's going on and your special little place in it. Yeah. Baldur's Gate, you are kidnapped, and there is a parasite that is put inside of you. You need to get rid of that parasite already. Okay, let's get rid of that parasite. Starfield, you're mining.
You're just a worker.
you're a worker miner person.
Yeah. And
it's the first day on the job. So, okay. Do you have an interest in mining as a player? I don't think so. Some people are talking to you. They're talking. They're talking about mining. Do I care yet about this? No.
Yeah.
You go through the basics of mining. And it's very brief. You go through the basics of mining. And then you find this room. And there's this piece of metal that's frankly kind of interesting to look at. I have a 4K TV in my room. I can't tell you a detail about this metal. It's vague. It's vague sci-fi metal.
Right.
You take it, and then you have a flash of just kind of colors, and you've passed out. And then you wake up and you make your character. What? I'm making my character now?
Yeah. It's
so what are my options to make a character? I've started off this story, and I'm a miner. And my options to make a character are biologist, ex-politician. Hold on. Before even going further, why is a ex-politician
mining?
A miner. What happened there? That's an interesting story. Can you explain it in the game? Explore it? I don't think so.
Right. Yeah, that's not the story that's being told.
And so then a dude is come to explain to you what's happened. Am I interested? No, I don't care about this yet. Like, it's so... How did one of the biggest companies in the world make this...
Yeah.
Set this up as a compelling story?
Totally.
Like, here's my prompt for the middle of the story. So you started at the height of the action. You know the feeling of a roller coaster when you go down a drop?
Yeah.
And you're kind of, guts like rise into your chest. Yep. You ever felt that on a plane?
I hate that on a plane.
Isn't that an interesting start? Because you're like, wait, what happened? How bad was it? The plane dipped below buildings. I'll start in the middle of the story. I was in a place called Thunder Bay in Canada at my cousin's wedding, coming back. The thing I've learned over time is that anytime you do anything, something always goes wrong. And so the thing that was going wrong in this day is that our flight was delayed.
Yeah.
And one of the workers at the airport was talking to us a little bit. Me and the cousin who was the brother of the one who got married.
Yeah.
And he was telling a story about this plane that came in about a month ago, where it was coming down, and then a gust of wind hits, and it goes like this, like this, and it drops beneath buildings, then it comes back up. I was on that plane.
No way.
That was my plane. I felt that on the inside of that plane.
Wow.
But anyways, like, I hope I've effectively shown an example of like, that's an interesting story. Yeah. Because now you're like, well, what I'm sure you have more questions about that
Totally.
story,
Yeah.
but I'm withholding, right? So you start at the height of the action, you give people like that needs more context. The last thing I'll say, unless you have any tangents or questions, the best thing that can happen to, I think, for example, like a podcast clip is if you go into the comments and people are going, context? What's the context for this? Context?
Yeah.
That's what you want.
Totally. Man, that was good. That was really good. I loved even just the way that you seeded just the idea of like, I love how you noticed how you seeded the story that you wanted to tell of your own life. And, just of like sprinkling that in there of, hey, in a second, I'm going to tell you about this. Fill. Okay, we've made it. And it's like, that's just like a little mini journey that, we were kind of taken on of like, I think that was a good example of that same concept that we talked about in like short form video of how, that can even take place in like a longer form context as well. And that was really interesting.
Yeah, I do it very intentionally. It's much harder, and this is just a personal thing between me and you about games. It's much harder to do it in D&D consistently because you're managing a bunch of other things.
Yeah, there's so many things to interrupt like the flow of that. So
but telling stories outside of that, I very consistently do that. And I hope just by like me as a speaker, I hope that communicates. And speaks for itself.
Jesse, I feel like this episode was as much just for fun for me as it was for value for our audience. But I wish we could talk for much longer, and maybe in the future we can have another episode where we just dive deep into random storytelling rants and all of the things.
Certainly.
But for real, we'll put the links for a lot of your stuff in the description of this video and also of the podcast version as well. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to come hang out with me on the Marketing Should Be Fun podcast. So thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for inviting me.